Welcome to the next episode of Great War Story. And everybody in these episodes is somehow connected to my grandfather, Robert Bruce Fowler. And this episode is the story of the death of Captain James Alexander Terrace Bell, who was mentioned briefly in part 5. He was also the second New Zealand officer to die in World War One. The gravestone you see there isn't his, though. That actually belongs to my uncle, who died in World War II. I may make a video about that also another day. And this is the slide that was in the previous PowerPoint, in which one of the privates was joking about Captain Bell, who was what they call a surgeon captain. He was a doctor, not really a military officer, and when he gave a command to the men, he asked them to please form too deep, which caused much amusement. Now, I mentioned that he was the second New Zealand officer to die. So before we go on to him, we should probably talk about who was the first New Zealand officer to die in the New Zealand Expeditionary Force. And this was another man from the New Zealand Medical Corps. It's a bit sad, really, that the first two officers to die were both doctors. Lieutenant Ernest John Herbert Webb, and he was 32 years old. His actual place of death was in Sri Lanka, which they called Ceylon at the time, on November the 17th, 1914. But in fact, the thing that caused him to die happened while he was on the transport ship Arawa, and it was during the King Neptune ceremonies. This is what happens when you cross the equator for the first time, and part of this involved dunking people in a small swimming pool, and he decided it would be a great idea to dive headfirst into the swimming pool. He did so, and he broke his neck and died from complications of this when he was taken off the ship when the convoy arrived at Colombo. And since we're talking about firsts, well, let's talk about some other firsts in terms of people dying. The first person to die when the New Zealand Expeditionary Force left New Zealand was Jack Gilchrist. He was a chemist. Americans would call him a pharmacist in civilian life, and he died at sea on October the 25th and was given a huge funeral at sea. Then there was another person who was in the field ambulance who died at sea. This was Private Harold John Lewis, only 20 years old, and he died on the convoy on November the 20th, 1914. The doctor's notes say it was influenza complicated with pneumonia. The New Zealand Medical Corps at this point was suffering far grimmer casualties than any other branch of the New Zealand Army. And while we're on the subject of firsts, the first New Zealander to die in actual combat was Private William Arthur Hamm, who was killed on February the 3rd, 1915, while defending the Suez Canal against an Ottoman attack. And I would also like to recommend this particular website to you. It's put together by the New Zealand Herald, and it's the World War One Roll of Honour. It's this incredible interactive thing where it actually lists everybody who was killed in the war, and you can mouse over it, and in this case you can see that I've moused over that particular figure, the third to last in 1914, and it comes up with the information of who that person was. Captain James Alexander Terrace Bell, died in Egypt. Now it says he died of disease. That's not 100% correct, and it says he was in the field artillery. That is in fact a complete mistake. They mistook the FA for field ambulance for FA for field artillery. I did actually email them about that, but they never somehow got around to fixing it. Despite a few mistakes like that, it's a wonderful website if you're trying to research casualties in World War II. Oh yeah, there's the mistake highlighted. Now, a lot of my investigations into what was going on with the New Zealand Mounted Field Ambulance in Egypt comes from their war diary, because it frequently mentions individuals, and this is the first time I encountered Captain Bell at all. So the very first entry was on the 8th of December. They hadn't been in Egypt very long at this point, less than a week, and this was the entry. Horses kicking themselves to pieces. Captain Bell's horse was badly kicked. Almost impossible for double picket to manage horses. 6 horses off the lines at one time after dark. The horses were rather jittery after having been on a long convoy aboard the transport ships, and they didn't really have anywhere properly to keep them at this point. So that was the very first mention of Captain Bell. Then on 27th of December, Captain Bell features again. Captain Bell, still complaining of giddiness, and attributes his ill health chiefly to the blocking of the passage from the nose to antrum. He wishes me to operate, which I've decided to do. Tragically, however, well, no, we're not quite up to the tragedy yet. December 28th, Captain Bell went to Egyptian Army Hospital for observation and treatment prior to operation, and then received word from Colonel Fenwick that Captain Bell was found on the floor in a fit at the hospital at about 4:20 a.m. and that he died at about 4:30 a.m. Whole unit were very fond of him and much upset at sad news. Cancelled parades and stopped leave. Captain Toms came to my tent early in the morning and gave me full instructions what Egyptian Army orders to carry out in connection with funeral. Attended to these with Lieutenant Colonel Fenwick in motor car. In the afternoon, Captain Toms made all the arrangements for the funeral, which was finally fixed at 3 p.m. at the cemetery. And Captain Bell was 43 years old at the time. And I managed to find only one other photo of him, and, well, I think you at least get a fairly good impression of what he looked like. He looks rather grim, but that's not at all what the descriptions of him are like. And while I looked up his military file to get some more information about it, the story, well, got sadder. He had actually been to war before. He had been a surgeon captain in the South African War, as it was called at the time. Nowadays we tend to call it the Boer War, but at the time it was always called the South African War. And he had got married in 1908, and he had had a son, John, and that boy was only 5 years old when his father died. I actually managed to find a little bit about him, not much, but enough to note that he died in 1980. He also had a daughter, Patricia Ann Terrace. She had not yet had her first birthday when her father died. And continuing with entries from the war diary actually makes a mistake. It only has 30 days in December. There is no entry for December 31st, but from other context, it's clear that the funeral happened on the 31st. This is what it said. Attended funeral in afternoon with all available men of unit. The funeral was 1 hour and 20 minutes late. Why? Because 1. The men under Major Newton lost their way finding the cemetery, and 2. Delay at Egyptian Army Hospital caused by no supervision having been ordered in connection with the removal of the body. It was a circus, a mess. Nothing was properly organized. Generals Maxwell, Birdwood, and Godley, and many staff present. General Maxwell was the British commanding officer in Egypt. Birdwood was the general in charge of the Australians. Godley was the New Zealand general. And there is a photo I found of all 3 men gathered together, along with the famous Lord Kitchener. And this was, I think, in November of 1915 at Gallipoli. I think they were probably planning the evacuation of Gallipoli at that point. Lady Godley sent a wreath, because General Godley had brought his wife with him on the convoy from New Zealand, and she was volunteering in a hospital. What was an interesting coincidence for me when I looked her up was to find that her maiden name was Fowler, the same name as my grandfather. And it also comments that the RAMC, the Royal Army Medical Corps, that's the British medical units, and the 3rd Lancashire Field Ambulance were also in attendance. And the service was conducted by Major Luxford. Now, he was an army chaplain who had actually been the army chaplain on the same transport that had carried General Godley and had carried the New Zealand Mounted Field Ambulance all the way from New Zealand to Egypt. And I managed to find on the Auckland War Memorial website a photo of his gravestone. Now, if you look at that picture, it looks like it says JAT Cell. And indeed, on the museum website, that's what it said in the caption. And I feel like I managed to do a little bit of public service because I emailed them with clear evidence that this was in fact referring to James Alexander Terrace Bell, and that there's just a slight dot of distortion in the photo that takes away the crossbar in the B, making it look like it's a bell. And since then, they've updated and corrected their website to show his correct name. Now, it's quite blurry, but you can just make out what it says at the foot of the cross. Died December 29th, 1914, erected by officers of the medical staff and the men of his unit. And somewhere or other, I couldn't find it this time, but I've read that they had a hand around where all the men put in a bit of money to contribute to the costs of the gravestone because he was a highly popular officer. And there's another photo of what his gravestone at the time looked like. Sometime or rather after that, there must have been a consolidation of the graves, and he was given a completely different and standardized headstone. And, well, there it is. The photo on the right, incidentally, shows General Godley attending a funeral. It's actually a funeral in France, but I thought it was the closest I could get to what we were dealing with. And the people in New Zealand were terribly interested in anything their boys were doing at war, and any letters from the front that arrived would often get published in New Zealand newspapers. So a month or two after the events, you often get some interesting information about what was happening elsewhere. And in this case, we get this story. Dr. Withers of Southbridge has received a letter from his son, Surgeon Captain Withers of the New Zealand Medical Corps, with the troops in Egypt, who makes the following reference to the death of Surgeon Captain Terrace Bell of Christchurch. No doubt you've heard the sad news of the death of poor Surgeon Captain Terrace Bell, which occurred here last week. He seemed to be in his usual state of health and was about camp all day until he went down to the Abbasia hospital in the evening to get ready for an operation. However, he died suddenly in his room, and we lost one of the best liked men in the force. All along, he was a particularly fine man, always most obliging and ready to do anything and everything for anybody. Nothing was too much trouble, and his advice and practical hints were always invaluable to those of us who were less experienced. We buried him with full military honours on the 31st. 3 generals and a large number of the New Zealand and Australian staffs were present. So far, there have been 6 deaths in the force, 2 infantrymen and 4 of the New Zealand Medical Corps, which is rather hard, seeing that we are about the smallest unit here. Still, such things are not of our doing, and we must not complain, I suppose. And then there's another letter from a bugler in the Mounted Field Ambulance, Bugler Thomas Francis Hardigan. And if you've been paying attention to past episodes, you'll know when you see an asterisk like that against the name, there will be a future episode about this particular individual. And he has a letter about the funeral. A sad event happened on Monday. Captain Terrace Bell of our company died at the Abbasia hospital from heart failure. At 5 p.m. he looked as healthy as could be, and as he passed me on his horse, he returned the salute I gave him, but I never thought it would be the last salute for him. At 9:30 he was taken away by motor car, and in the morning we received word that he had passed away during the night. The chaps here were greatly cut up about it, and so was I. I've served under several officers since I first joined the Queen's Cadets, but I can truthfully say that he was the best and most liberal officer I have ever been under. On the boat, he used to come up to our quarters every night and distribute whole packets of toffee and such like, with always a kind word for everyone. He was only too pleased to tell us anything, and he was never out of temper during the whole time I was under him. The funeral was held yesterday. I was supposed to play the last post over the grave, but a party of trumpeters played it instead. The trumpet sounded much better than a bugle would. The last few notes, where it sounds like lights out, were so soft, and echoes so lovely and tragic, and fitted the last post so well, that most of us couldn't help letting go a few tears. We had to. But it was soon over, and now most of us are reconciled and are still going on in the same old way, quite realizing that it is one of the very sad parts of a soldier's life. And something I'll tell you about Hardigan. He had lied to get into the army. The minimum age to go was supposed to be 20 in 1914. He was only 17, so he really was much too young to be there. And one more account. Private R.A. Kerr, from Sumner, of the New Zealand Mounted Ambulance, writes from the Egyptian military hospital at Pont de Cuba, Cairo. Captain Terrace Bell died very suddenly in hospital, where he had been doing good work amongst the patients. We all went to the funeral last Wednesday, the cemetery being 9 miles away. I think that might explain why the men were late getting there. The service was most touching. The next day another death occurred, this time an Australian, and there's likelihood of still another passing away any minute. And what is he referring to there, that someone is likely to die very soon? Well, it's because there's somebody on his deathbed who would indeed die. And his name was Trooper George van der Graaff Burlinson of the Wellington Mounted Rifle. While he was on horseback, his horse had reared up and thrown him, and he was badly injured. He had been around for a while, though. He had also served in the South African War, similar to Captain Bell, and his medical chart at least lets you know he was quite tall. He was 6'2". And the enlistment paper for South Africa actually said he's too tall and his chest is too small for standard measurement. They let him in anyway, but technically he must have been a bit of a beanpole, I guess you'd call him. And after falling from his horse on December the 31st, he eventually died on January the 15th. And I believe this was leaving the funeral of Bell. And also, this is speculation, but I've read elsewhere that horses that had not encountered camels before can get panicked. And I suspect that may well have been what happened. And that's why Trooper Burlinson was thrown and later died. The official medical papers say he died of septicemia following a ruptured urethra. And also later says he died of sickness. Well, technically this is true, he died of sickness, but it was really complications caused by the fall from his horse. And I actually managed to find a photo of his gravestone. There he was, age 30. And it was nice to know that Edinburgh University keeps track of its alumni and particularly noted James Alexander Terrace Bell as one of their own, a graduate who had been through their school. And here it is from 1915 on the right. Captain James Alexander Terrace Bell is reported to have died in Egypt. Captain Bell graduated MBCM in the University of Edinburgh in 1895 and MD with honours in 1902. After acting as house physician in various hospitals in this country and in South Africa, he settled at Christchurch, New Zealand. He accompanied the New Zealand contingent to Egypt for service in the war. And Bell's military file says he was in fact born in Christchurch, so he must have travelled to the United Kingdom to do his medical training before eventually returning to his home country. There's only one more PowerPoint slide, and I'm not sure whether to be sad about this. It feels sad to me somehow. I found a web page of an auction house that had sold 3 medals that belonged to him. They actually got £840 for this collection, and it makes me think that there aren't any grandchildren. There were no family members to inherit those medals. So the whole thing is a sad story, and I guess I'm also ending on a somewhat sad note. But that's all I have for you about the death of James Alexander Terrace Bell.